After a week of assiduous effort, I have finally made my way to the end of Mahler's First Symphony as far as my analysis and running commentary are concerned. It's been quite a ride, and it has occurred to me along the way that I'm probably going to need to preface this chapter of my YouTube series with some explanatory remarks regarding this composer who is quite different from any of the others I've attempted to treat. I thought a good way to begin that might be to read the opening portion of Michael Steinberg's chapter on the Mahler Symphonies in its entirety. It's a little long and wordy, but I believe it throws more light on this composer than I could possibly hope to do with my own remarks. So here goes. Gustav Mahler was born in Kalisz, Bohemia on 7 July 1860 and died in Vienna on 18 May 1911. Mahler once said he was thrice homeless, as a Bohemian among Austrians, as an Austrian among Germans, and as a Jew everywhere in the world. The village where he was born is about 60 miles southeast of Prague, and the trumpet calls he heard from its military garrison ghost through his music. His father, first a carter, then the owner of a small liquor store, which he parlayed into a reasonably successful distillery, was an intellectually awake, unhappy, brutal man. His mother, sweet, plain, and with a limp, was forced by her parents to marry Bernhard Mahler, whom she did not know, and even though she loved someone else. Not surprisingly, she was wretched. Gustav was the second of Bernhard and Marie Mahler's 14 children. Of the 14, 8 died in infancy or childhood. When Mahler wrote his Kindertotenlieder, his 2 daughters were alive and well, but he was an expert on the deaths of children. In addition, his sister Leopoldine died at 26 of a brain tumor or meningitis, and his brother Otto, also a talented musician, committed suicide at 21. His brother Louis, at times also known as Alois and Hans Christian, immigrated to Chicago, where he became a baker and eventually vanished. A childhood memory reported by Sigmund Freud, whom Mahler consulted in 1910, not on the famous couch at Berggasse 19, but during a long walk on a beach near Leiden in Holland. Once, when Bernhard Mahler was especially abusive to his wife, Gustav, unable to bear the scene any longer, rushed headlong from the house, all but crashing into an organ grinder, who was playing the popular song Ach du lieber Augustin. Startling juxtapositions of the tragic and the frivolous became a hallmark of Mahler's style. Indeed, no feature of his music was more disturbing to his listeners. That the name of the Dutch town where they met is the German for suffering must have given some grim amusement to doctor and patient. Mahler was a poor student as a boy. Nonetheless, a local businessman got him an audition with the pianist Julius Epstein at the Vienna Conservatory, who was immediately convinced that the 15-year-old boy was a remarkable musician. That fall, Mahler began his bumpy career at the conservatory, where, along with his piano lessons with Epstein, he studied harmony with Robert Fuchs and composition with Robert Kren, and several times collided with Joseph Helmsberger, a distinguished quartet leader and committed anti-Semite. One of Mahler's roommates was Hugo Wolf, one of the greatest of all songwriters. Another was the immensely gifted Hans Roth, who died at 24, and from whose impressive Symphony in E, written 1878 through 80, Mahler learned a lot. A third was the violinist and conductor Rudolf Krishnovsky. Wolf, Roth, and Krishnovsky all died insane. At 20, Mahler took his first job as conductor, leading the summer operetta season at Bad Hall near Linz. That was starting at the bottom with a vengeance, but over the next few years, Mahler climbed the career ladder, moving to Laibach, Ichlau, Olmütz, Kassel, Prague, Leipzig, Budapest, Hamburg, and eventually in 1897, Vienna. It was also in 1897 that Mahler was received into the Roman Catholic Church. To what extent this was a career move in the face of Viennese anti-Semitism, to what extent a spiritual need or even an aesthetic response, is still debated. With Artur Nikisch, 5 years his senior, and Arturo Toscanini, 7 years his junior, he was one of the great conductors in his generation, passionate, personal, electrifying. As in his composition, he never came down on the side of caution. He loved and detested conducting. That is, he loved the opportunity to shape musical objects according to his penetrating vision, and hated the constant compromise and friction with musicians less possessed than himself. Similarly, the sheer rush that came from performance both exhilarated and drained him. Conducting was his source of income from that first summer of 1880 at Bad Hall till the end of his life, and of necessity he became a summer composer, finding retreats at Steinberg and later at Lake Wurth in Carinthia and Toblach in the Dolomites. Quiet was a constant quest, and to ensure it was one of the primary assignments of the women in his life. His sister Justine, various friends, and eventually his wife, the gifted, magnetic, and beautiful Alma Schindler, whom he married in 1902. Before Alma, there had been a serious succession of lovers, most of them sopranos, at the opera houses where he conducted. Essentially, Mahler was a composer of songs and symphonies, and the two genres crossed interestingly in his life work. Of Mahler symphonies, there are 9 or 10 or 11, depending on how you count. The matter of the symphonies numbered 1 through 9 is clear-cut. The difficulty is that with Beethoven's Ninth and Bruckner's unfinished Ninth in mind, Mahler entertained a deep-rooted superstition about Ninth symphonies, thinking of them as a limit beyond which no composer could go. The work that followed the Symphony No. 8 was a song cycle, Das Lied von der Erde, the Song of the Earth. But Mahler sought to deceive the counting gods by calling it a symphony for alto, tenor, and orchestra, though not assigning it a number. Thus, Das Lied was a secret 9th symphony, while the next work, the symphony he called No. 9, was really the 10th. Furthermore, he made sufficient progress on an actual 10th symphony for several musicians to have produced performing versions that, although controversial, have entered the active repertory. Mahler's symphonies fall into groups whose members share points of view and even material details, each piece being more richly understood in the context of its group. The first group consists of the first 4 symphonies. These are, to a large extent, based on songs by Mahler himself, and 3 of them actually use voices. In No. 1, the orchestra quotes the Lieder eines fahrenden Gesellen, Songs of a Wayfarer, of 1884. The texts of those songs are Mahler's own, but the style of the poetry owes much to Des Knaben Wunderhorn, The Boy's Magic Horn, a collection of folk verse assembled and considerably fixed up at the beginning of the 19th century by the poets Achim von Arnim and Clemens Brentano. The next 3 symphonies include vocal settings of Wunderhorn texts along with words by other writers, again including Mahler himself. Then come 3 purely orchestral and profoundly exploring symphonies. These too make references to songs, particularly to the Kindertotenlieder, but these references are both rarer and less explicit than those in the first 4 symphonies. No. 6 is one of the most admired and most passionately loved by those who know their Mahler best. Arnold Schoenberg, Anton Webern, and Alban Berg at the head of the parade. The 5th, 6th, and 7th all begin with marches in a minor key, and explicitly funereal ones in Numbers 5 and 7. But No. 6, the central panel of the triptych, stands out in various ways. Numbers 5 and 7 have exuberantly cheerful last movements. No. 6 has Mahler's only tragic close. Numbers 5 and 7 are 5-movement symphonies. 2 linked pairs of movements enclose a central scherzo in number 5, while 2 large movements enclose a triple intermezzo, night music, scherzo, night music, in number 7. Number 6 is the only symphony that Mahler planned from the beginning as a 4-movement work in the traditional design. The whirlwind that was the last chapter of Mahler's not very long but tumultuous life began in 1907. 4 momentous things happened that year. On 17 March, Mahler resigned the artistic directorship of the Vienna Court Opera, bringing to a close a 10-year term whose achievement has become legend. Mahler was, however, drained by the struggles and tempests that were the price of that achievement, worn down by anti-Semitic attacks on himself and his young protege Bruno Walter, and feeling the need to give more time to the composition and performance of his own music. He was not, however, able to resist the lure of the podium, nor to do without his income as a conductor, and on 5 June he signed a contract with the Metropolitan Opera in New York, where he would make his debut conducting Tristan und Isolde on New Year's Day, 1908. On 5 July, his daughter Maria, 4 and a half, died at the end of a 2-week battle with scarlet fever and diphtheria, just hours after an emergency tracheotomy had been performed at the Mahler's summer house at Meiernich in Carinthia. A few days after the funeral, a physician who had come to examine Mahler's exhausted wife and her seriously ill mother responded to the composer's half-joking, "As long as you're here, you might as well have a look at me too," discovered that things were not as they should be with Mahler's heart. Most biographies report a diagnosis of subacute bacterial endocarditis. Recent interpretation of the evidence suggests that what was discovered was a defect in the mitral valve, presumably stemming either from Mahler's family history or rheumatic fever. Subacute bacterial endocarditis would be a result of this defect, but would probably have developed no earlier than the fall of 1910. It is not a condition Mahler would have been likely to survive for 4 years. Beginning with Mahler's widow, biographers have tended to dramatize the account of his physical condition after the summer of 1907. In any event, Mahler, that dedicated hiker, cyclist, and swimmer, to say nothing of fiery conductor, was put on a regimen of depressingly restricted activity. Still, what happened from 1907 until 1911 is not the life story of an invalid. 1907. Concerts in St. Petersburg and Helsinki, his meeting with Sibelius, the last opera performance in Vienna, Fidelio, played to half a house, and the last concert there, his own Symphony No. 2, departure for New York. 1908. Performances at the Metropolitan Opera at the beginning and end of the year, concerts with the New York Symphony, the premiere in Prague of the 3-year-old Symphony No. 7, the composition that summer of Das Lied von der Erde. 1909. The termination of his association with the Met and the start of a 3-year contract with the dilapidated New York Philharmonic. Work on the Symphony No. 9. 1910. Concerts with the Philharmonic in New York and other American cities, engagements in Paris and Rome, the triumphant premiere in Munich of his Symphony No. 8, written the summer of 1906, the completion of the 9th Symphony followed immediately by extensive and concentrated work on the 10th, the meeting at Leiden with Freud. 1911. The last New York Philharmonic concert on 21 February, including the premiere of Busoni's Berceuse Elegiaque, a man's cradle song at his mother's coffin. Then came the onset of a streptococcal blood infection, unsuccessful serum treatment in Paris, and on 18 May, death in a Vienna sanatorium. No doubt, Richard Strauss remarked, he'll now become a great man in Vienna, too. Into this 1907 through 11 chapter falls the complex and diverse final group of Mahler's work. It begins with two vocal works, the Symphony No. 8 and Das Lied von der Erde, continues with the Symphony No. 9, and leads to the unfinished 10th. Number 9 is in some respects commentary upon an extension of Das Lied von der Erde, while the 10th both quotes that work and further explores certain ideas and features of the 9th. Bruno Walter, a friend since he had become a coach and chorus master on Mahler's staff at the Hamburg Opera in 1894, later a devoted advocate during the decades when to regard Mahler as a great composer was to hold an absurd minority opinion, conducted the posthumous premieres of Das Lied von der Erde and the 9th Symphony. Now, I'd like to offer a few unscripted and no doubt unpolished remarks of my own. I once heard American composer George Crumb indicate that Johannes Brahms was the last of the great symphonists whose symphonies can be credibly reduced to piano four hands and still sound pretty much like the original work. That certainly could not be said of Gustav Mahler's symphonies, and that's true generally of music since Mahler. Something like that is true also of any way of talking about Mahler's music compared to the ways one talks about music prior to his time. The approach that I've taken so far in this YouTube series has been that of a formalist in its most basic meaning. I have focused on the music structure, and that includes, of course, its harmonic structure, which is integral to the whole, and have offered relatively little in commentary by way of the psychological profile of the piece. I have ventured into it here and there, with the Berlioz Symphonie Fantastique, for instance, unavoidably, and the symphonies I treated by Tchaikovsky, and even the third of Brahms. But that dimension now overwhelms the symphonies under examination, and my approach will have to change accordingly. I will still attempt to give a useful formal guide through these works, examining them part by part and explaining how the sections work together. But my focus will increasingly be on extra musical aspects of the work, and I'm not always competent to dip very deeply into those waters. You may have to indulge me. I think I also need to say that Mahler's symphonies tend to be long, some of them extraordinarily so. And I may discover that it's advisable to break some of my videos up into 2 installments, as I did with the Beethoven Ninth. I don't know, perhaps there are sufficient numbers of viewers who would be willing to watch a video that's close to 2 hours long. But I think I'm probably going to err on the side of caution in this case. I can't think of anything else I really need to say about this right now. I hope the reading of the Steinberg article was useful to you, and even that these paltry remarks might shed some light on what you can expect to see in my first video of this new chapter, the video over the First Symphony, which will no doubt appear within the next couple of days, perhaps even as early as tomorrow if things go well.